Oh, hey, it's been forever since I done um, a video talking about philosophical whatever aliens and the giants and the past history is and all that stuff. So, um, I figure maybe I'll do a video because I was studying some histories before and I had some insights. See if I can show them. I'm kind of stoned right now, but um, so the question is, at what point along the spectrum does truth lie in pertinence to how real or like how real are aliens and how much of a interaction with us have they had, and same thing with giants, how alien are giants from the past and how native to the earth, like in a scientific way of looking at the world, are they? Because it's believing in giants and aliens and stuff. It's not necessarily on the same. A lot of people like to talk about those two things, but it's not. It doesn't have to be in the same category. I know Graham Hancock believes in like a past world civilization, but he looks at it from a scientific way. But he's not into aliens at all. So he's never doesn't want to talk about Roswell or Bob Lazar or any of that stuff. Face on Mars. Yeah, I don't know what he thinks about that, but so I think in the future, more and more like mainstream scientists will believe in giants being real and Atlantis and that kind of stuff. So let's get started, okay? Well, let me get started really quickly with Atlantis. I want to explain my Atlantis story because that's super interesting. So Atlantis, the legend of Atlantis was that it, according to Plato, who's the only actual source for Atlantis. Although I might be wrong about that, I may have heard, because I've listened to all those books multiple times. I may have heard like Xenophon or somebody, I don't know, one of those other guys say it briefly, but pretty much Plato is the. When it comes to the information, Plato is the only thing. Okay, we know about Atlantis. And he said that that Atlantis sunk 9,000 years before Solon, who was 6,000 BC. So that's 11,600 years ago, which is right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas, which is where the Ice Age ended suddenly. All of the like 85% of animals bigger than a dog died, and the sea levels rose. And so he's talking about a worldly civilization that was an island out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and they were having a war with Athens. Okay, so we're talking about a civilization that it was at least as worldly, and in terms of like technologically advanced, and in terms of size of the world, actually larger than the ancient world until now, because this is when they were doing seafair between the Americas and Europe, and they didn't even find America until 1492. So that's kind of interesting to think about in itself, that in the times of the Greeks, they were looking back to a time that was more advanced, and they believed in the gods, and, Egypt was before them and everything. But he said that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And if you do the Christopher Columbus thing, just go beyond the Pillars of Hercules and keep sailing along the Pacific I mean the Atlantic. On good winds in 3 weeks you get there. It's just a straight shot. And the island that he landed on was one of the islands right next to where Atlantis is, which is the shallow part of the Caribbean. It's the island of Andros. And if you look at the underwater island, like if you were to lower the water 60 feet, the island would come up, and so that's the part of Andros, Greater Andros, and it's the part that's the bluest when you look at it, the Caribbean from space. It's clearly an island that got the top washed off of it, like if your kid's playing with sandcastles and then the big wave comes and knocks your sandcastle down, your sandcastle would look like Andros and around there. It'd be like a mound just under the water. But Plato said that it was, in terms of stadia, he said it was 550 by 350 kilometers, and that's exactly how big that island is. There's two things that you have going for you. And stuff starts to get really interesting when you start stacking the coincidences up on top of each other. So there's the coincidence of there was a catastrophe that the world ended and people had to start from scratch. And Plato mentioned that, and a bunch of other Greek philosophers mentioned it too. I'm going to make a collection of it one day, soon, like this year. So he said that there was a flood, and so then the water rose 12,000 years ago, and that's exactly what happened with the island there. Everybody knows that. There's the coincidence number one. Coincidence number two is that you're going to find an island 550 kilometers by 350 kilometers straight out from the pillars of Hercules. Okay, or that you're going to find an island, and then that's the island. It's the same damn size, exact same size. And then he described the city itself. Now you can download it off of Google Earth. I'll put it from what I made, and I'll put a link to it below. But he said that there was the inner circles. That's what everybody sees when you Google Atlantis. You can see the circles, and there were 1,200 boats in there. But he also described how big the city was in terms of with the walls. He said if you go out another 10 kilometers, there's a wall, and even said how high the wall was, I think. There's a wall that goes around, and he said exactly how big it was. And if you look at the city, it's pretty dang big. It's like dang near as big as Miami, which is near. It's like as big as Denver, basically the same size as Greater Denver. Like a metropolis that's a believable metropolis from the ancient world. Like probably about the size of, and I think I did a superimposition, and it may even be for download, but it's basically the size of Greater Rome. And Greater Rome today is about the size of the ring, and that's about the size of Greater Rome in its past as well, on its height. I know that because Pliny said how many steps it was from 7 roads from the center, and I traced it. He's talking about urban Rome, metropolitan Rome, not like the city limits where there's stuff going on, but like how far out the houses stretched along the 7 roads. So yeah, about the same size. So anyways, he said how big it was, and I went and looked on that island, and it's kind of like a horseshoe-shaped island. He said there were like mountains on it, and that would be modern-day Andros. But I imagined where the city would be if people were going to go to that island and set up a city on the ideal spot, and it would be at the bottom of the horseshoe, right there, pretty much on the coast. The wall's not so far from the coast because they had the canal go in all the way into the city center. And I placed it there, and I built it as per specs from Plato. And then after I built it, I saw it. And here is coincidence number 4. I saw the ring, the wall ring, and it was the same exact size as the one that I built, and it was right next to it. He also said there was 1,500 kilometers worth of canals, and you can put 1,500 kilometers of canals on that island. That's about what it would take. So, but that would be a very ideal place. That would be, if you're going to imagine, and you have to imagine, because I take it literally, okay? Fundamentalist historian. I'm not going to take no grains of salt with Plato. I'm going to believe it. So if you believe that 12,000 up until 11,600 years ago, there was world civilization where the Greeks were fighting people in America. That was even bigger and grander than the ancient Rome at its height. Or anywhere in the ancient world. Then oh man, I got my sidetracked. Oh yeah, if people were gonna create a society, that would be the perfect place that they would go. Like English became the world language because England is a perfectly insulated island the size of a country that you can regulate well. Like Montesquieu talks about that. About those that they have advantages like that, in Japan too. And Atlantis is about the same size. So if maybe a little bit too high to keep my train of thought. Oh yeah, so if people are going to go there, that would be the spot that they'd want to go, because especially in those days, because you have to remember that there were gigantic bears and mountain lions and saber-toothed tigers and sloths and monsters that would hunt humans, And so to have an island like that where they couldn't swim out and get you is just ideal. That's what you want. Anything else, the people who lived on the mainland at that time, and I'm sure that they were rivaling them in technology, and there was like a kingdom like that, in mainland America. They would have, like, say, the Cahokia Mound on St. Louis. It's built right next to the ancient river, but the river that was there a long time ago, it looks like that river was there a long time ago, so I'm not so sure. I believe Cahokia was from like 1,000 years ago, So, but imagine having a civilization in the mainland where where you've got giant predators all over the place. They could have, obviously we could have hunted them, and fought them. They weren't like that much bigger, than modern day animals, but it wouldn't have been as pleasant. So anyways, that's what I think about Atlantis. Yeah, now if you're going to talk about the alien influence on Atlantis, I think the best way to talk about that stuff, aliens, is to explain both sides of it to the best of your knowledge, like you believe that side, but then try to explain exactly what you believe. So I'll explain, 2 scenarios having to do with Atlantis. I think a scenario like the Graham Hancock scenario, where no alien involvement at all. It's just years and years of evolution, just like us. Only they went a slightly different path of technology, and they learned some things that we don't know technologically, just like we made some advancements that they didn't. And but and then another idea is that aliens came. Now I think back in those days there were so many different kinds of humans that there are different kinds of people having different experiences. So it's like different types of souls entering in. More different than today. So yeah, I mean, maybe people could like reincarnate there from Mars. I think there was a story about that. But so yeah, that's what I think. But I think let me talk about aliens really quickly. I think it's possible to believe in like science, but also the prime directive. So and time travel. So I think aliens are here and all that kind of stuff. Like they have sightings of flying saucers from the ancient books, but at the same time, you can completely ignore them because they were just watching in the first place. As far as like technology of ancient Egypt and all that kind of stuff, and if aliens caused it, maybe they could have like come to people in their dreams, or taught somebody, or a crash that people back engineered or whatever. But yeah, and then they found it that way. But it's kind of like it's so yeah. I believe. I think you can believe in both. But for the most part, you would believe in just regular Darwinian evolution because it's prime directive. They're just mainly just watching. Okay, so let me talk about the giants. Now, that's interesting subject because some people be like, oh yeah, they were like the ancient Egyptians and stuff are aliens, and so they're giant aliens who came here from somewhere else. But let's believe. I don't believe that, because I think that everything that lives in the world, was seeded in the world and evolved from the world. The extent of extraterrestrial influence on biology on the Earth, I think, is limited to meteorites. Like possibly, like spores that turned into like octopuses could have crashed to Earth on a meteorite and stuff like that. But as far as like giant aliens, I did listen to the Book of Enki by Sakurai Sitchin, translation of the Sumerian tablets, which is on my website, but I only listened to it once, and I haven't really had the time to sit down and fully think about it recently. But I mean that believing the aliens coming in here from another planet, Marduk, and using humans to mine, and that there were giants here, that makes sense, but I haven't processed it enough, so I don't really need it to fall into my paradigm, because I have another idea of how giant humans could have come into existence that is that makes just as much sense or more sense. So, and that is it's a phenomenon, and I can't remember the name of it. People were talking about it on like a genetics channel, but it's when there is a abundance of a certain species, and then that species can dimorph very easily when it doesn't have competitors. It's kind of like how the world has lots of different animals in the world. Well, this would be a situation where the world has lots of variations of the same animal, because maybe there was a catastrophe and all the other animals died out, and so this one animal's left, and then it repopulated so much and spread out that all those different versions of it got to thrive and fill up the whole ecosystem. And so then they stay put, and then they actually manage to adapt to their environment and turn into various species, but of the same one. And you see that a lot with, I think, like explosions of the mammals after the dinosaur die-off. But I think that's what happened with humans, okay? Because there was a point in history where humans, I think, like suddenly got the upper hand on the bigger animals. For a long time, humans lived in trees, and that was because they were not the kings. It was the lions and the tigers and the bears down on the forest floor that eat you all the time. And then we learned how to stand upright so that we could see above the grass at the lions whose eyes were lower than us, so we could see them before they could see us, and be able to run away from them or avoid them and stuff like that. Be able to fight them better. And then when we learned how to harness fire, and then make better tools, that was a point, and then organize better, that was a point where we really got the upper hand on the animals. And I think at that point where we learned how to fight the animals in groups with cooperation, is where we were able to just explode. Because we figured it out, and then that's when we traveled all over the world, spread out all over, 100,000 years ago. I don't remember the exact timeline right now, but and so as a result, we overpopulate, and then we all dimorph. We all adapt to the spots that we settle in. Okay, so that's how you could have Homo floresiensis, the 3 foot 5 inch tall munchkin human being, basically. I mean, they're basically like us, but they're 3.5 feet tall, living on the island in Sumatra. I mean, unlike Borneo. Along with the munchkin elephants. Up until 13,000 years ago, these little guys lived, because they got island insularism. There's this thing called insular island smallism, where things on an island become super small because the resources aren't as much, so the little ones survive better. You had little munchkin, like 400 pound mammoths up on an island in Siberia, off of Siberia. Those were the ones that lived up until 4,000 years ago, the ones who lived the longest. And then you have other situations where they become extremely large because there's no predators. Animals that other places would be smaller. Like, I think Cyprus used to have giant, like, rabbits and birds and stuff like that. And they also had munchkin rhinoceroses, triceratops. But, so yeah, as a result, that happens to humans as well. And so, cats. Cats are all different sizes. And so you had Homo floresiensis on the island there because they didn't have predators, and the resources weren't much, so the little people survived better. Okay, now you could go to the other end. Here's where the giants come in. You could come to the other end where people get super huge, way bigger than we are now. Now, when would you get a situation like that? Well, same thing with animals. You'd get a situation like that where you need to be super big to get your prey. So I can imagine, and if you do get your prey, because you're big, you can eat as much of it as you want and feed yourself easily and get as big as you want because of that. Now, I can picture Siberia in the ice ages with giant mastodons all over the place, and giant saber-toothed tigers and long-legged 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound bears with the giant sloths, and then you've got the huge-ass hyenas and all that kind of stuff that you have to defend yourself against, so you have to be big to be able to do that. Well, that is exactly what it was like in Siberia back in the ice ages. So I think that's how humans evolved, to be huge up there, because they needed to be big to take down the mastodons and to fight off saber-toothed tigers. and there were enough mastodons where they could just kill mastodons and then feast, and so they could eat. But they got run into trouble when they had to move down south, when they couldn't hunt as many mastodons, and they were living amongst regular sized humans. They had trouble because they couldn't. They'd have to eat a lot more in order to stay alive because they're bigger. And so that's where the myths about how they were cannibals came in, because they were starving all the time and they would eat each other in order to survive, and eat little humans in order to survive. Because I think maybe that was when you hear the legends of giants from Native Americans and other people throughout the world. They're telling the tale of the tail end of the giants, right before the giants went completely extinct, right? So what happens to a species at the tail end, right before they go extinct? That's when they're having the most trouble. So the giants would have been having trouble at that point. Not enough mastodons to kill, People have a theory that the mastodons and the saber-toothed tigers and everything went extinct because humans overhunted. And I think that does play a part if you're talking about starving giants. And so, I do believe in the giants. And I think if you're going to think like a scientist, you should, because of all of the stories that people used to tell and even the pictures you see from the past. They were stockpiled in the thousands of them, I think, because they found them in mounds in the Smithsonian Institute. But then, like 10 years ago, they had to give them back to all the Native American tribes because the tribes said that they were their ancestors. And then the tribes, I guess, there's no communication. The tribes didn't say what they did with it. Maybe they destroyed them, burnt them. But I don't know why people just don't ask the tribes what they did, but ask the Native Americans. I think we'll eventually find proof of giant bones that were that big. And so they were about 10 feet tall. They were up to 12 feet tall. And I can picture people that big surviving up in Siberia and amongst all those giant animals. So there's this Denisovan. They're related to the Denisovans, I think. They found a Denisovan tooth, and this Denisovan cave is called Denisova Cave up in Siberia, like the western end of Mongolia. And somebody said that the Denisovan tooth, like normal mainstream geneticists, never mentioned the tooth was big, but other people said the tooth was giant. And I saw a picture of it, so if it was a true picture, I actually measured. Comparing the size of the tooth, I measured how big the person would be, and it was like 10 feet tall. So there's this other animal called Gigantopithecus, but that was more of an ancestor of the orangutan. But there's another example of how, primates can get giant too. So if the primates got giant, humans can too. So as far as I think, but they were saying that humans were mating with Denisovans and Neanderthal. So I think if you're going to make a story, like I want to make a story from the past, like, people make movies right now. We're on our Marvel kick. In the future, I think we're going to start doing more historical movies, and actually ancient historical movies, Atlantis and that kind of stuff, legends and the giants. And if you're going to make a movie about the giants, I think, there was a lot of interbreeding going on and intermixing between different people, all the different hominoids, as they started to get more expansive in their territory themselves and bump into each other. That's kind of how we can have all the different traits. They say that Europeans have 2 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in them, and if you accumulate all the people, because there's more people alive now than there ever were, there's actually more Neanderthal DNA now than there was at the height of Neanderthals. There were no more than 50,000 Neanderthals alive in the world at any given moment in time. Because and I think they didn't do as well as humans because they the way that they lived, it was not as civilized. They didn't work together in hunting. One paleontologist said they only spoke to each other in the imperative. And if you look at their bodies, they were all beat up and bruised, and the women just as much as the men. So they probably did hunting like dogs did, and so they didn't. They kind of traveled in separate tribes, and they didn't unite. And it's kind of like how Europeans took over the Native Americans. You know, the Homo sapiens were just better organizers. So yeah, they went extinct about 40,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago, the Neanderthals. Yeah, and then if you have stories of the Egyptians, giants, you know, like the statues of giants standing next to little people, it makes sense that the giants from up north migrated down south and actually became kings, lorded over people, our ancestors who were our size, because they were bigger and they could kick their ass. They were just like another higher race, like racism, and they were the leaders and we were the slaves. But the ancient world did believe in giants, which is really interesting. Pliny says in his book, which is on my website, that it's common knowledge that people's children are shorter than their parents in the times of the Romans. So that tells me that the gigantic genome, which was mixed in with humans, was still present 2,000 years ago in the time of Pliny. So they must have not have gone extinct that far before. And also because they had all they were legends. They had found caves. This guy called Gyges, in the story, Herodotus tells it. It happened in Croesus's territory, kingdom of Lydia. The king Gyges, I think the original king of Lydia, fell in a hole and then looked over, and it was a giant's tomb. Like it was like 10 feet tall. But there were other stories like that too. And there were actually giants in ancient Rome. There was a 3-foot tall person in ancient Rome, but there was a man and wife who were leaders of the army, who actually led an army in the Middle East, who were 12 feet tall. And when they died, they were like 10 or 12 feet tall. They're like 10 feet, which is way bigger than anybody alive now. So they had a gene, if you're going to believe Pliny. And you know, those guys didn't understand science that well, but Pliny said that their bodies were in Severus's house as a museum piece, preserved in the time of Pliny. Anybody could go and watch him, look at him standing there being giant. So that's, I mean, if you're going to believe that, then that means that there were giants then that aren't even alive now. Big people were bigger. The biggest people were way bigger in the time of the Romans. Like, I find it hard to believe that he would lie about stuff like that, you know? I don't really even believe people lying about sizes of armies, but I think people misunderstand stuff. You know, like Herodotus thought that black people's semen was black. But I don't think people lie like Pliny. So the giants must have existed in the time of the Romans. But just some other interesting things that I found out too, that I think are super interesting, that people don't, that kind of point to an ancient civilization that actually did exist, and ancient world culture and world travel, and the world was just as big, like crazy long ago, like 10,000 years ago as it was like in the ancient world. And one example of that, and this is super trivial, this is crazy. There's a book called The Book of Invasions from Ireland, and they don't know how old the book is. Like it's legendary tales from the beginning of frickin' Ireland. I'm gonna go and look here exactly how what the date was, because I have it written on the front. It's called the Irish Book of Invasions. Just a second, let me hear Irish Book of Invasions. Da da da. Irish Book of Invasions of 2500 BC. That's what it was. So people don't know when the Book of Invasions was or the tales were from, and the tales were from 2500 BC. That's like at the time of the creation of the pyramids. It's like 2,000 years before Herodotus. So it's crazy to think that legends go back that far, but I think they do. You know, I mean, we know of we went through most of the time since Jesus was the Dark Ages, like just as primitive as the time of ancient times or more. And we think of Jesus as happening just yesterday, you know, but it was 2,000 years ago. So the people who lived 2,000 years ago, a lot of people around there, like Celts or whatever, probably had legends of stuff from 2,000 years before them, which seemed like yesterday. You know, like kingdoms only last 500 to 1,000 years if they're lucky, or 250 years, but legends can last longer, in traditions, you know, nations. And but the crazy thing is, in the Book of Invasions, they're talking about fucking Scythia. They're saying that the people who invaded Ireland came from Scythia in 30 boats, and it took them 9 months to get there. Scythia. Scythia is Ukraine, Russia, Mongolia, like an inner Russia. That's Scythia. So, according to history, there was trade and travel on the boats through the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov and the Mediterranean, all the way up through the Straits of Gibraltar and up into Ireland. 2,500 BC. Like the Romans never went to Ireland. They never knew how to boat that far. I don't think they even took boats that way. They went through land to France and then just took the boats across the 30-mile Strait of England. Yet 2,500 years before the Romans, Scythians were just floating all the way up, their merry way up to. And you know, there's actually a story from ancient Greek. Herodotus tells it from the ancient Egyptians did a boat ride around, exploring, went out of the Straits of Gibraltar and then around, circumnavigated. And we know how hard it is to cross the Horn of South Africa, and they managed to go all the way around Africa and up the Red Sea. One Egyptian guy did it. Yeah, so the world was advanced back then, which gives you more reason to believe that, yeah, there could have been Atlantis and that island across the sea. And so yeah, I think back in those days. See, I'm trying to paint a picture of what the world was like back in the time of the Dark Ages, the Ice Ages. So so there must have been a world culture, probably dominated by descendants of the giants. Now let's see why maybe they were. Because one interesting thing, and I don't think people realize this. People don't know this, but this is common scientific knowledge, that humans' ancestors were bigger than us. Their heads were bigger than ours. Our ancestors were people called Cro-Magnon. That's the person that came before Homo sapien. Okay, there's like Homo sapien, the beginnings of Homo sapien, along the side of living alongside the Neanderthal, those guys are Cro-Magnons. They turned into us. Okay. So what's the difference between, why are they called Cro-Magnon and not Homo sapien? Why are they a different species of human? Well, the reason is they have enough physical differences, and those physical differences are, wait for it, they were taller than us, and their heads were bigger than us. You know what a bigger head means? It means you're smarter. The Neanderthals had bigger heads than us too, but their frontal lobe was smaller, and their social structure was more primitive. But what I'm saying is, if Cro-Magnon, if our ancestors were bigger than us and had bigger heads than us, that means they were smarter than us, because you can judge the intelligence of an animal based on its brain size compared to its body size. It's a scientific rule, law. And that's why dinosaurs are so dumb. So their heads were bigger compared to their bodies than modern humans. So we actually, according to mainstream science, have actually devolved in terms of evolution of humanity. We devolve because evolution of humanity, everybody knows, is getting bigger and getting bigger heads and bigger brains. You know, the Homo habilis is more primitive because his brain's smaller. So then, how the hell did it become that humanity went up like this and then descended again, got smaller brains again, and smaller bodies? Well, that could explain why there was such amazing technology in the past. Maybe the reason that they knew how to do all the ancient technological wizardry with the rocks and the building of the pyramids and everything was because they were so smart, because they had bigger brains. They thought of something that we didn't. And also because they were maybe more related, because we were kind of interbreeding and stuff. Maybe we were just generally more related to the giants back in those days, because it was the ice ages, but since then we got smaller because we didn't have to be smaller, because the predators were smaller and everything was generally smaller for that reason. But the interesting thing is imagining the world and what it was like with all the different humans, because we know there were lots of variations of human that we don't know about because we just haven't found them yet. And so there's probably stuff kind of in between the giants. And if you do look at the skeletons, there are different sizes. You have the 12-footers, 10-footers, but then you have a bunch of 8-footers and 7-footers. So the way I would interpret that is that those are completely different species. Okay, so you have Homo sapien, which is what we are. Now I'm talking about all the different humanoids who existed in the ice ages. You had us, Homo sapien, Homo floresiensis, the 3.5-footer from Indonesia, the 12-foot giants from Scandinavia, or from Siberia, hunting the saber-tooth, hunting the mastodons and fighting saber-tooth tigers. But then you had another variation, kind of maybe a couple thousand miles away, who were only 10 feet tall, because you have lots of variations of lions and tigers and bears and stuff, And so then maybe you had the 8-footers 1,000 miles down the way, and then you had the 7-footers over here, you know what I mean? And then because humanity was just kind of exploding that way, and until they got squeezed out, and then they mixed and turned into us. But oh man, I was gonna say something else. Anyways, yeah. So it's interesting to think about the past. Yeah. So I guess that's it. So now as far, what do I think about Bigfoot? Somebody interviewed Bashar, the guy Daryl Anka, who channels Bashar, and I thought, and he actually was talking about how he's an alien. Bigfoot's an alien, and I talked to a guy who said he went to Burma and saw Bigfoot's skin on the wall of a restaurant himself, and everybody there believes in him. So maybe Bigfoot is some kind of like intelligent alien that's just hanging out, like watching us. I don't know. But it makes sense. But the problem is, I heard Joe Rogan talking about this. Where people usually see Bigfoots are up in the Pacific Northwest, but that's where bears are, and bears walk on their hind legs, and it's really thick out there, so it's easy to mistake a bear for Bigfoot. But but yeah, I'll just go for the aliens visiting. But then there's another tales of the Amazons, and the Amazon rainforest. Or Francisco de Orellana wrote a book called Journey Down the Nile in like the 1500s. And he was the first person to go down the Nile. It was like the 1530s. And amazing story, because they had to like rebuild their boat from scratch on the Amazon and float it down the Amazon. Like, those guys were badasses. And they had to fight off like all the Indians. Like a huge army of them came after him, trying to kill him. But at one point, one group of Indians that came were led by, he didn't say how big, but he said they were gigantic and muscular and topless. So I'm imagining like 7 foot tall, 300-pound, blonde girls, white blue-eyed blonde girls with long blonde braided hair, topless, whose spears were like as big as humans because they were so big and strong, and like nobody could beat them up, but they were shooting them with their guns, so that's how they won the war. And any of the Indians who were fighting for them tried to run away, they would kill them themselves with a club. And that all the Indians from all over the Amazon traveled from all over literally all over the entire Amazon to try to go to their kingdom city to mate with them. But then they came back later, 100 years later, and there weren't, they didn't find the tribes that they were describing and stuff, or the girls. So I think his story there, he made up that story because he was trying to get people interested to sponsor him to go back again, because he really wanted to go back again. He actually did go back again and then got murdered. So I think he made that up, but I think he made it up from ancient legends that the Indians had from before, maybe a long time before, from the time of Atlantis. Because like I said before, legends can last, 2,000 years like it's yesterday, so then they would last 10,000 years, okay? People in the past were really good at memorizing and telling stories. That's why black people are really good. Like Tupac was really good at memorizing his rap songs, because black people didn't have written language for thousands of years. I have Native American myths and legends on my website, and there's all these different flood stories, and they're talking about how, the rains kept coming and coming and coming, and the rains lifted up, and so they eventually had to build boats to hide in, and then they just floated, and then the land went away, disappeared, and then they floated and finally found land again after they were living off the boat. Well, that sounds like a scientific description of what you would expect people to experience at the end of the Ice Age, when the comet hit and it melted the icebergs, and they just flooded all into, like, in mass, huge, gigantic, I think it was like 5 times taller than the waterfalls, 5 times taller than Niagara Falls up there in like Washington. And so the people who got stuck in the middle of that, they probably saw the water. In a lot of places who survived, they saw the water coming and the rain coming, because the rain, that's what did happen scientifically, because it was big. It was like a big snowball. The comet was a big snowball, so it crashed, but it also rained down forever, and 40 days and 40 nights, like how the Bible says. And so there's lots of myths and legends on my website of Native Americans, and one in particular where they're in the boat floating. And so that's actually a story from 12,000 years ago. Okay, like we may think of like an ancient myth and a legend of maybe it was like a story your drunken grandfather made up 500 years ago. And if it was 500 years ago, oh, well, that's how amazing it was 500 years they got to keep the legend. But I'm thinking, no, 12,000 years they actually kept the legend. And so that's why the legends get so kind of, like diluted and confusing after a time, the telephone game. But, do have legends of stuff like Atlantis. There's a story of there are these Indians called I can't remember what they're called, but they have a town named after them up in North Dakota, and they live differently from all the other Indians. They're white-skinned Indians, and you can see pictures of them. They look like more white-skinned Indians, but they're full-on Native Americans. They're right next to the Crows, who were really dark, so it was like a different race, and they lived differently from everybody else. They lived in a city with a wall around it, kind of like the Europeans did, and they cooked, and they had utensils and tools and all this stuff. But they have a legend because they've been around forever. The Mandans. They have a legend that some guy staggered in one day, like saying that he came from Atlantis, and it just got flooded out. And yeah, so yeah, that's interesting. I think you can take, if you know how to filter out, the truth from the mythology. I think you can take all of these mythological stories as history, actual historical fact. That's how I interpret it, because enough of them match science. Like how the flood stories from the past matches with the science of the actual flood, and the timeline it matches up and everything. So basically, the moral of the story today is that I think if you're going to talk about alien influence versus human influence with all the different humans and technologies of the past, I think the proper way to look at it would be mainstream Darwinian evolution, but but you can also believe the aliens, but the aliens were there just as observers. And so that's why they show up in stories. Because it's like people visiting Ezekiel and taking him up in the spaceship, and Alexander the Great having help from an alien shooting a laser beam out of the wall to break the wall of Tyre, and when there was the Jewish revolt in 70 A.D., a bunch of chariots were seen, and horses and chariots were seen flying around in the sky. And then the paintings you see with the flying saucers in the background, and I think we can believe all that too. But it didn't have anything to do with us. Like, they're just observing aliens observing us. So if you're going to look at how the world actually, the dynamics of the world, it's all to be seen through mainstream science, Darwinian evolution, and you can explain all the different giants and humanoids that way, because animals dimorph. Now, if you're going to talk about exactly how the humans mated amongst one another, like if you wanted to, write a story about it, or history story or a movie or whatever, write a history book. I think a good way to go about it would be just use the same rules, and that's what I'm going to do on my fighter levels. I'm going to do it that way. You basically use the same kind of rules as lions and tigers and bears do it. There's all different kinds of big cats and different mixes of them. If you mix a female tiger with a male lion, then you're going to get a liger, which is bigger than a lion or a tiger. But if you mix a male tiger with a female lion, then you're going to get a tigon, which is smaller than both a tiger and a lion. Now, why is that? We don't know. And if you mix like a jaguar with a lion, you're going to get like a jagion or whatever, but it's going to be sterile, Or if you mix like a leopard with a tiger, you'll get a tigard, but it'll die after 3 months. This kind of stuff. So same thing with humans. You could tell a story like if you mix Neanderthal with a Cro-Magnon, then you get a Neanderthal, and those tend to be sterile, and they tend to be bigger than both Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. Those are the ones with the double rows of teeth. You know what I mean? So I think there's all kinds of creative stories that you could tell, and make interesting movies and books or whatever, stories from the Ice Ages with all the humans, but have all of that phantasmical variation of monsters and ghouls and all that kind of stuff, and humans and giants, but have it be but rooted in the real scientific world. And it doesn't have to be fantasy genre. It can be real scientific, realistic genre. And it would be super interesting to just explore the different relationship dynamics between all those different humanoids, because they would act differently as well. We know that like I was saying before, the Neanderthals are much more tribal than the Homo sapiens. Couldn't work together as well, and so then you could make up stories about, and then they hunted more hardcore, more physically. They jumped and they'd get injured and killed in battle more, and so you could kind of tell a story maybe of the 12-foot giants, and that they were just as violent and nasty as the Neanderthals were, because they would jump on the backs of the mastodons and wrestle them to the ground and stuff like that. But or that like they kept humans as pets, like there's a story from Odysseus where the giant on the island of Crete or whatever kept Odysseus and his friends in the cave because he was using them as food. Yeah, anyway, so that's what I think. The moral of the story is, I think you can believe in an ancient past that existed and then disappeared, and that we have ebbs and flows of everything based on our environment, and then you can believe in the aliens. You can basically believe in everything, okay? But and nothing has to kind of get in the way of anything else. Yeah, it's kind of. I think it's kind of. I don't think it's helpful. It's not good for for communication when you kind of get negative. Because I saw Graham Hancock kind of get negative about the alien stuff. I mean, I agree with him when he said, you don't need that alien stuff to believe in an ancient civilization because it's all scientific. But you don't have to go. But you can also say, but it's interesting stuff, and I believe it for its own right. I mean, I can talk about that. You know what I mean? So that's what I think the future of academics is. It's people just accepting, just believing all of it, or people being able to talk about every subject. In the future, like the Graham Hancock counterpart from 100 years isn't going to be. Every single time you talk to him, he's talking about the ancient civilization. You know what I mean? You're going to be able to find plenty of videos of them talking about the aliens, because everybody talks about everything in 100 years. And so that way we can help each other. We can all help us all find this perfect balance between it all, where actually truth lies, and figure out truth that way, collaboratively. So that's what I believe about the aliens and everything. I think you can believe in all of it. And even with like ancient civilization, I mean, I think it's possible for aliens to just fly here and give us stuff, and there's, I mean, even out there stuff, like you have these doors drilled into, like carved perfectly into the wall, but they don't go anywhere in South America and Egypt, and people say they're portals to Mars and stuff. I think it's okay to believe that, I actually believe it. Why the hell not? But, that could just be for certain people who were like visitors on the earth back in those days, but they wouldn't visit now because we're all living we're in a different stage of development where we're all growing on our own. So anyways, that's almost an hour. I don't want to go above. So that's basically, and there's some other interesting stuff. Let me continue a little bit more, because humans, the races, we found some amazing things about race just over the last 5 years with mitochondrial DNA. We figured out how to go in there and crack it open, and I think it passes just through the mother, but it actually tells us what we looked like. So Europeans, all over Europe, they had dark skin. People in Europe, North Europe, like England, France, Germany, had dark skin like Middle Easterners, brown skin, but they all had blue eyes. And so the reason that there's white people with blue eyes and brown skin, I mean white people with like blue eyes and brown eyes in Europe now, and not brown people with blue eyes, is because they migrated in from modern day Russia, like northern Siberia, where the Denisovans are, the giants. And they wandered in there because they had their own explosion of technology when they suddenly had a mutation which made them lactose tolerant. So all of a sudden they could live off of the milk of their cows and the herd animals without getting sick and having diarrhea and dying. They all of a sudden they could like live off of that, and they'd had all this energy, and so they took over. They took over all the other weaklings who couldn't live so easily. And so because of that, they started herding animals, which made them tame horses, which made them ride horses, which made them invent chariots, which made them, make empires and kingdoms and start a empire and move out west. And so that's when they moved out. This is 4,000 years ago. And we know that from DNA. Moved out west. And wait, no, here's the crazy part. It was 2,500 BC, which is 4,500 years ago, which is when the Book of Invasions about the Irish talk about. So when the Irish are talking about the Tuatha De Danann and the giants on the islands and stuff, they're talking about a race that doesn't even exist anymore. That's a tale of people who don't exist anymore because they were replaced by the Scythians, because the Book of Invasions said they came from Scythia. But if you study the haplogroup DNA, it says the same exact thing, that white people who were lactose tolerant, who had brown hair, white people, moved in suddenly en masse to Europe and killed off like 100% of the males and married the females, and so they kind of melted a little bit in genetically with us. The closest race to that race that doesn't exist anymore are the Sardinians, but those Sardinians are the closest race to them, but they were even more, like dark-skinned and blue eyes, and so they got completely wiped out by us and our new technology with the horses and lactose tolerance. And yeah, that's the story of the Book of Invasions. So we actually have historical record of that. Not just mitochondrial, but historical written record in the Book of Invasions from Ireland. So I thought that was amazing, how mitochondrial DNA and the Book of Invasions both say that the Scythians took over the Irish, the Celts and stuff. Well, the Scythians turned into the Celts, and then the Celts got wiped out by the Romans. When the Romans say that the Celts, they weren't wiped out, they were like incorporated, but there was a genocide. Like they killed 5 million people, I think, in France. Julius Caesar did, just with his 20,000 troops. But they said that the Celts were giants, like huge, muscular, big, tall people, and the Germans and stuff. So they could have been, more related to the ancient giants who went in there. But before they got intermixed, with the smaller Romans. So anyway, so that's some interesting information. There's lots of amazing new information coming out with the science, the haplogroup stuff. You should definitely check that stuff out. And they're learning more and more because it's getting cheaper and cheaper, and they're finding more and more samples. So yeah, I can't wait till they actually like genetically make like 3D print from genetic and de-encodings of all the animals they find. Or even recreate mastodons. I mean, they can now. They found a mastodon that still had his hair on. So that's pretty amazing. Okay, so that's enough talking for now. Update on aliens and ancient civilizations and giants and monsters and stuff. Peace out.